Okay, so welcome. It's March 7th, 2015. This is a LaRouche Pack San Francisco discussion. We are live on the web. Maybe that sounds, for those listening on the internet. I'm going to give a short introduction tonight with a sense of the political situation, where we stand in the world, and also the significance of what Pat's going to discuss with the specific case study of the Russia situation, and largely Russia's response in World War II and the significance that has today. So let me just give people a sense of where things are. My name is Glass-Steagall, by the way. I'm part of the National Policy Committee with the LaRouche Political Action Committee. I work with Lyndon pretty closely. We're at a very determining point in history. We have really two courses, two directions mankind can go. Many people have some conception of this or some sense of intimation of the tensions. One is the system that's been dominating the United States and the transatlantic community for some number of decades now. And it's largely taken over with the 1990s. I mean, beginning really with George Bush Sr.'s administration, our country has gone into a disaster zone, really a fascist takeover. And since 9/11, the attacks then, our entire Constitution has been shredded. There's almost no living aspect of a Constitution. You have to think, realize that law is not something that you program into computers. I mean, laws that people live by, principles that people live by. The separation of powers, as a basic example, is not something you can program into institutions, like you might program a computer. It actually has to be something that's living in the minds of the individuals. It also has to be in the culture. It has to be something that the people generally identify with as their culture. If you eradicate that out, or give necessity by which that no longer needs to be lived by, it can go away, regardless of what your documents say. So we're not dealing with something mechanical. We're not dealing with something inanimate. We're not dealing with something simply biological. We are dealing with something uniquely human. History is a uniquely human study. It is not something. We're not trying to fix a broken down car. Only if we work. So this transatlantic system, typified by the United States' trajectory over the last 15 years, has been of a fascist nature. It's not something unusual. The Norman conquest of France in 1066 was a fascist invasion of England. Napoleon's invasion across Europe was a similar type of program. Same with Adolf Hitler. These things this isn't something new. The Persian invasion, the collapse of Greek civilization, from the Battle of Marathon and Salamis to what happened with the Thucydides War. You see levels of corruption. You see a collapse of a population, a collapse of a sense of dignity. And what you fundamentally see is a collapse of a national identity, which is unique to that nation in its contribution to the human species. Any nation that exists, any language that exists today, exists because it has reason to exist. It gives a sense of identity, a sense of creativity to the people which participate in that in some form. If it didn't, then there'd be no reason to continue to propagate that culture, to maintain it. The question, though, is what is it that's human? What is it that's actually human about the process? And this is what Mr. LaRouche has been emphatic about in this time period. Because we either can go with the transatlantic system, we can go with a collapsed financial system, we can go with a policy of warfare. What does a collapsed financial and economic system mean? It means, in essence, it means you take away the meaning of life of most of your population. And in doing so, you cast most people to the side as something irrelevant. That may not look, we're not talking about an economic condition for the American people today similar towards some of the economic conditions of worse times. But Mr. LaRouche has been emphatic since the 1950s that when you take away from a culture and from a people its meaning for existence, you will ultimately produce those same economic results over time of the worst economic conditions in human existence, the worst barbaric forms of slavery or of the treatment of human population as true cattle. You will repeat that because you've taken away the meaning of that culture's existence and the meaning of those individual lives, meaning they won't fight for something. They won't fight for what actually means something to their nation and to their culture and to their people. You take away that sense of human identity. That's what the financial and economic collapse is. And they've built up a massive bubble of debt. Just for an example, the president of Argentina made it a case in point recently that the debt of the world increased at 280% at the rate of so-called economic wealth of GDP. GDP includes the inflated value of your home or the parking tickets you pay. So GDP is a little bit of a strange number. But all of that GDP globally combined, the debt increased annually last year at 280% of that GDP growth, or GDP total value. If you did that, if you went into debt 3 times your annual salary, you'd be having some severe problems. And you certainly wouldn't say you're having a great economic recovery. You'd be hard-pressed to say things are great. I mean, you could say that because you're living at 4 times your means. So maybe you could justify it, but you'd be equivalent to a crackhead, just living off of a high. That's the current system, the transatlantic system. Now there is another system that's developing, and it's a system. It's in nations which our country has developed stereotypical views of. It's in Russia. It's in China. It's in India. It's in Egypt, South Africa, Brazil, Argentina. You know, these former socialist-aligned countries in South America, these impoverished or dictator-dominated nations of Africa. But the reality is that no one can deny that China represents a large percentage of the human species, also one of the oldest cultures, one of the oldest civilizations, thousands of years old. India, thousands of years old. Russia's as old as England in terms of an actual national identity. But Russia's also a major world strategic power. When they were, and as Pat's going to go through, I mean, this country established itself in World War II as willing to do whatever it took to stop a fascist takeover of the planet. And that literally meant for the Russians whatever it took. It took about everything. So these are significant nations. We like to look down on them. We like to say, well, China's just so polluted. God, how inferior. I mean, the worst hubris of culture comes from even from some of the environmental areas of the United States political spectrum. They're so open for tolerance. Oh, but those Chinese. Oh, but those Indians. Oh, those Russians. Oh, those Brazilians. Wait a minute. I thought this was so-called the inclusion. Bring people in. So these nations have developed a system, an economic system. Russia, China, India, Brazil, South Africa are called the BRICS. Nations like Argentina and Egypt have directly aligned themselves with it. Nations like Iran are moving in that direction. Nations like Greece could be moving in that direction. Countries like South Korea, a key ally of the United States in the Pacific, could very well be moving in the direction of working with those countries. So, I mean, you know, Koreans still, their hearts break. If you ever talk to a Korean of an older age, their hearts break that their country is still divided, much like the Germans did up until '89. It's like their country had been torn apart. And China and Russia play a big role in unifying Korea. So these nations, now what's the system that they've developed? Well, it's a system that's actually American. It's known as the American system. It was set up with it's the idea that you basically take your financial capital that you have and consider that a national resource. It isn't a resource for private individuals or private corporations. Your financial resources, it doesn't mean that some of those financial resources aren't in the hands of some corporations or some individuals. That's the case with anything. Some things are privately held, some things are publicly held in any country. But it's still a nation. The nation isn't just the government. And then the private people try to find a way to get around the government. It's not like some kind of cat and mouse game between private citizens and the government. I mean, it's a nation, it's everything. It's its institutions, it's its history, it's its language, it's its form of government, it's its institutions, it's its private corporations, it's manufacturing companies. It's a nation. And the American system looked at that system, American system, looked to the resources of that nation, all of it, and particularly its financial resources, in a way that would advance the overall productivity of the country as a whole. And he would target specific and key problems of that nation with those financial resources and with your human resources. That you would deploy your population and you would fund the projects necessary to raise that population's productivity up. So for example, Alexander Hamilton was key in launching a program that helped to build the Erie Canal. Because Hamilton, who set up this system under government, said, look, we've got this whole area of coal and iron in western Pennsylvania, in the Ohio River Valley, in these areas of the Great Lakes. How do we access that? How do we make it economically viable for the city centers of the coast to access this rich area of the development of our country? Well, we're going to fund a canal. Well, who's going to fund it? Well, we'll wait and see if Wall Street does. Forget about it. Wall Street at that time was practically known as a British institution. I mean, they weren't helping to fight the war. So you find the ways of doing it. The railroad program, the electricity of Edison was not funded by Wall Street. It was funded by banking interests tied to the nation, tied to the government in Philadelphia. And they built up and helped develop the country. And then Wall Street, Rockefeller, goes and buys up the petroleum industry and plays organized crime-like tactics. They go after Thomas Edison, J.P. Morgan does, and consolidate that aspect. And Wall Street becomes a dominant entity, so-called responsible for American industry, in the 1880s, 1890s period. But that was a scam because all of those things had already been initiated and developed under a system of development of the country called the American system. And then only after the fact of Wall Street's takeover do you say, oh, Wall Street did it. I mean, they rewrote the history books. As the old saying goes, you know, who wins the war, so-called. They thought they won the war. They rewrite the history. Wall Street built the railroads. Wall Street developed the petroleum industry. Wall Street developed electricity. All a fraud. All a total fraud. And it's still propagated today. And we'll get back to that because that's one of the key points that Mr. LaRouche knows is what we face as Americans today, which is the question of popular opinion, what people generally accept as true. But these nations, because of what Mr. LaRouche and our organization did, we took these ideas. We actually found this American system school. We brought it back to consciousness in the American population. There's not one university in the United States which teaches this economic school of thought. Yet it was dominant up until this 1880s, 1890s period in American society. Not one university even teaches it in a history class. Yet we discovered it. We brought it back to bear, and we took it to these other nations. We took it to Mexico, Argentina, and Brazil in the early 1980s. And we said, we're going to, Mr. LaRouche offered to them specifically a program called the IMF debt bomb. Blow up the IMF, default, and watch it sink. Because it's a criminal institution that deserves an early death. Now, the president of Mexico was willing. The presidents of Brazil and Argentina were not. Didn't work. This was the same time Mr. LaRouche was working with President Ronald Reagan into developing an offer to the Russians of a similar American system approach, that the Russians, the Soviets, and the U.S. scientific institutions would collaborate with each other with backed financial resources, shared research and development budget. That means you wouldn't have redundancy of research, of a program of a defense capability against a nuclear launch that would ensure mankind's survival. Because as anyone who grew up in the Cold War knows, and Ronald Reagan was very personal about this, we cannot risk the survival of the human species. We have no right, no institution, no government leader has any right ever to risk the existence of the human species. And so Mr. LaRouche's proposal was a shared program with the Soviets and the Americans to defend the human species. It was a satellite-based system, laser-based satellite system called the Strategic Defense Initiative. This is the American system. In addition to that, though, and with the fall of the wall, we took these same ideas to China. 1995, 96, we went to China and said you should build a new Silk Road. 20 years later, China's announced they're going to build a new Silk Road. They happened to mention, their foreign ministry happened to mention earlier this week, yeah, it was proposed to us 20 years ago. We should build a new Silk Road, but we didn't have the capital then. China was practically still backwoods in 1995. But now they have the capital. They've built up their country using similar practices that we did in the United States. And they've now launched the program we've said, which means that China's development is now not towards China. China is recognizing it plays a role in developing what you would say is the Eurasian landmass from Lisbon, Portugal, all the way to Shanghai. But also then, a new Silk Road is actually a global program. It's the Bering Strait, into Alaska, Canada, and the Americas, down into South America, and all throughout Africa. That's really the Silk Road program, or Eurasian Land Bridge, that we've offered. So when the BRICS nation came to exist, this BRICS idea of an economic system came to exist, clearly and distinctly last July, it wasn't without our organization's input. It wasn't with a unique American perspective involved. So that's useful. It's useful to know. That's the BRICS system. The other system is this criminal fraud system of the transatlantic, which is really anti-American. It is Wall Street. It is London. And the difficulty we face is making sure that we resolve the situation today towards the BRICS. What's the danger? The financial system of transatlantic is collapsing. And the power interests of that system are fraught with collapse. Collapse of power. Collapse of control. And they're willing to exercise anything, including nuclear war with Russia, to force nations to capitulate, to force nations to comply. And this is what you see over the Ukraine situation. This is what you see with the murder of a irrelevant political figure in Russia, Nemtsov. He's more useful to this fascist oligarchy dead than alive. So we're risking nuclear war. That's what you see. We have military deployments all along Eastern Europe. Increasing levels of deployments, increasing levels of anti-missile defense systems to enable a first strike capability, meaning Russia couldn't retaliate. And their plan is not just to launch nuclear annihilation. That's to no one's benefit, but to attempt to restrict the nuclear attack to something on Europe and Asia alone. That yes, you'll destroy large parts of Europe and Asia, but there will be aspects of which you can still maintain your fascist oligarchical system. It's a fantasy, but they've got limited, what they call limited tactical nuclear weapons. Now these are megatons equivalent to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, all over Europe. Turkey, Italy, Belgium, Germany.
But if it's only one attack from Russia or United States, whatever, after 10 years, all humanity died with this solution.
Right. Yeah.
1 million. One time is enough.
One time's enough, and the point is that no nation could survive, no government could survive without a retaliation. The pull for revenge. If Russia is attacked, if the Donbass region of Russia was attacked with nuclear weapons, with so-called tactical, so-called battlefield nuclear weapons, which are now intermediate range weapons, if that were to occur, Russia would have to retaliate in some form. Otherwise, the government would fall in an even more severe dictatorship could rise.
The military sector will react.
Right. So you have these psychological characteristics in a nation and into government. So there is no capability of a limited nuclear war. And that, as the point you make, it's true. Even with a nuclear strike at the level we're talking about, the consequences still threaten mankind's existence. So there are major forces at play. There are major figures that we're talking to in the United States. Jack Matlock, former ambassador to the Soviet Union. Stephen Cohen, leading professor on Russia from Princeton and NYU. Professor Mearsheimer from the University of Chicago. Have been recently in Europe. Have been in Germany. Germany's Der Spiegel has come out with a number of articles going against the Hawks, going against the fascist Victoria Nuland, Victoria's secret of, the Azov Battalion, the Banderas in Ukraine, these Nazi types in Ukraine. We call it Victoria's little secret. So we're threatened with world war and nuclear war. And for many people who are unaware of history, including the American people today, how warfare unfolds, they're unaware. They're delusional. They're fantasy-ridden. They're corrupt by popular opinion. They're corrupt by pessimism. They're corrupt because they've lost a sense of national identity in a true sense. Like the response you see from Russia against this fascist attack, which is a legitimate one, the Americans continue to bend over while they're continually economically destroyed. And their own military areas are destroyed in these kinds of shenanigan wars. So a response has to be, something has to be done to address this. Now, steps have been taken. People are warning of the crisis of the war. No one here can say that we've, at this point, done enough to avert war. War could break out in the near term. An uncontrollable war that leads to nuclear war. That's undeniable. That means that everything we can do to change that must be done. Now, the key point, which most strategists avoid, is the economic driving point. That what's driving this conflict is the bankruptcy of this system, which is propelling these institutions of London and Wall Street, the European Central Bank, this control. You could call it just traditionally the British Empire. Those institutions are going bankrupt, and they are propelling this fascist attack at an accelerating rate because now the BRICS exist. If Russia and China were not so closely aligned, if Russia would not have the potential to do what they're doing in the same way, China would not have the military capability of fending off this kind of military aggression from the West. So the relationship between Russia and China are key, and yet they're not isolated just the two of them. They're closely tied into many different countries. And that's a key aspect of what the threat is. So this BRICS system, the BRICS plus collection of nations, is a critical factor. A deciding point is coming down around the Greece situation, specifically because of this economic question. Greece is bankrupt. It's been destroyed. But the whole entire European Union system is bankrupt. The whole transatlantic financial system, like I said, has increased its debt 3 times just in this past year alone compared to its wealth. Yeah, we are bankrupt. We are bankrupt entirely. Now, Greece has the opportunity to say, we're not going to pay. If Greece alone, a small country, says we're not going to pay, that's it. Now, Greece will still have to secure loans. They'll have to secure some loans with Russia and China. Very possible. They're going to launch major infrastructure projects. We've actually laid out an entire perspective of development. So just last night, Mr. LaRouche, in discussion with associates, who then presented this publicly, has called explicitly for Greece to leave the euro and orient towards the BRICS nations. It's the only option. Over the past couple of days, the European Central Bank under Mario Draghi, the Queen of England's agent, I mean, he works for the Queen of England, more than anyone else, Mario Draghi, has basically said, we will give you nothing. You will have nothing. No financial liquidity, no lending. He is violating all of the basic European Union treaties. They're not complying by anything. It is just hardcore tactics. Until you commit to killing your population, you will get nothing. And Greece now owes significant hundreds of millions of dollars each week of this month to the IMF. And the IMF should just be bankrupted. They should just be put out of existence. It's a failed system. It's a failed institution. And Greece has the ability to do that. So our solidarity with Greece is critical. Now, what is Greece fighting with? There are interests in Greece who have disconnected their sense of the true importance and significance of Greece culture. There are people who are thinking of themselves, of their survival, of their interests, and not of the Greek people, but not of mankind, not of Europe, not of European civilization, hinged upon Plato, hinged upon Socrates, hinged upon these great ideas. Some in Greece, however, are rekindling that sense of identity publicly. We are Plato. You owe us. Some Greeks have called. The European people owe us. What would you have without Socrates and Plato? What would you have without Aeschylus and Greek drama? Would you have Beethoven? Would you have Shakespeare? Would you have Schiller? Would you have your great art, your great politics, your great philosophy? Without these figures? Without Greece? And that's critical. That's where you see a willingness to fight fascism, because fascism is by its nature anti-history. It is by its nature anti-culture. It tries to reduce you to an immediate instinctual survival, to an animal, to get you to act like an animal. And to the extent you're willing to submit to that, either because of how depraved you are or because of how pessimistic you've become about mankind, you will accept fascism. But to the extent you actually have a sense of what it means to be human, through your own cultural expression, if you know other cultures, all the better. But at least within every culture, there is something that stands out. And there certainly is within the United States. And the challenge we have today is to resurrect, or to, I'm going to say it, resurrect maybe means it's already dead. It's not dead, but to have a resurgence, to revitalize the true sense of American identity. And this nation was something unique, in the sense that we were the attempt to escape this European fascism. Going back even to the Dark Ages, going to the Italian Renaissance, which sparked this great idea of mankind within Europe, again, finally, since the Greeks. Remember, the Italian Renaissance went back to Plato. It was Plato brought from Greece to Italy, which set the foundations for the great European Renaissance, both in Italy, then later in Weimar Germany. But they also saw fascism there, leading figures in Europe. And they said, we have to escape this. We have to be able to set up something where these ideas can not just express themselves in thought and culture, but it can express themselves in the form of the state itself that will dominate the views of the nation as a political and economic identity. It's often said that Americans' greatest poets are its political leaders. Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther King, John Quincy Adams. To an extent that's consistent with American culture. Because we have demonstrated throughout our history, if a nation is developed according to this view of man, the view of man of Plato and Socrates, of Da Vinci and Cusa, of Kepler, of Joan of Arc, if you develop a state according to that, it flourishes. And there are no challenges that cannot be surpassed. Within 60 years, you went from the Wright brothers' first flying of an airplane to a man landing on the moon in this country, because of that kind of outlook, that Promethean conception. And it's that loss of that in American culture today, the depravity of the entertainment, the depravity of an economy, which is most of the time is corrupt. Real estate is a corrupt institution. It is. There's nothing you're developing. You're not adding anything in most cases. Most of it's handing one thing over after another just for inflation to occur. And these assholes on Wall Street and in Washington, D.C. call that inflation economic growth. Even back when I was in college, that was considered stupidity. Now, just a few years later, that's considered, you know, economic dogma. So we've got to rekindle this sense of American identity. That's really the fight every day in organizing this population. And we see it. All of us who are out talking to people in the American population, it's like it's heralded that we found a good American. I talked to an American signed up. We talk to a lot of Russians right now. A lot of Russians come over. A lot of other people who have different perspectives from different cultures interact with us. But an American, like here for a few generations, American, that's kind of a unique specimen these days. You're not really American, you know. So that's something we have to fight for, because if we don't, we perish. Now the question how you do that isn't something just directly talking about Alexander Hamilton or Lincoln, though it's useful. It takes a kind of subjective commitment to reawaken the emotions, the passion, the courage that was emblematic of that development of our country. It can't just be a reference. It can't be an academic reference. It has to be living. And that passion is not simply American. That passion is universal. It is actually what governs the course of human development. It's what governs the course of human history. As we see with someone like Joan of Arc, who at 19 perished and yet shaped all of modern history. Without what she had contributed, there would not have been an Italian Renaissance. There would not have been a nation-state conception. There would not have been an American Revolution. So it's those kinds of questions that we have to address within ourselves today. But the project before us is this revival of a true American identity as a key contribution in collaboration with the BRICS to redefine what the human species is, to break us away from this animal-like culture that has been subservient to fascism over and over and over again. No longer can we be subservient to this fascist takeover. No part of mankind should be. No part of mankind should accept what's happened to Africa. That should be seen as a great crime that everyone should be appalled by. And that's what we're fighting for. We have a chance to do it. In these next days, Greece may have to make a major decision. This system is bankrupt. They're bluffing. They can't force Greece to do anything. They have nothing to stand on except brutal intimidation and nuclear war. So I will I'll leave the discussion, the initial discussion there, because I think Pat can add a lot to consideration of these ideas within that study. But I'll just take one or two questions if there are on the perhaps in the political situation or just things people are thinking initially.
You know that the military capability of the United States, the current one?
Well, it remains the, well...
I heard some people say, oh yeah, Sam's hidden super weapons, and that they could outmatch Russia and China and Iran altogether, but on the other side I hear, no match. Those days are over.
Yeah, I think it would be dangerous just to be naive. The U.S. military arsenal is fairly serious. It's a global. It's an extinction threat. It's an extinction threat. 1 second. For example, Russia does not have a satellite capability detection of a nuclear launch. They have only land-based radar capabilities, which means they're very limited to what they can perceive, and their response time to a nuclear launch from ICBMs would be very slow. We're talking 3 minutes. So the capability of the United States is overpowering. We've just spent $1 trillion. This was covered by a leading defense expert from MIT, Ted Posner. We've spent over $1 trillion upgrading our nuclear arsenal for advanced aggressive capabilities, penetrating missile defense systems, penetrating other questions. Precision targeting. These are what have largely also advanced the nuclear weapons deployed onto Europe, so that they have greater megaton, greater travel capacity, distance capacity, as well as precision targeting. Now, Russia and China have made it very clear that regardless of the size and strength of U.S. military capability, they have retained the ability technologically for retaliation. China has largely premised this upon their nuclear submarines. They came out maybe 6 months ago and said that they have the ability with their submarine nuclear arsenal to annihilate everything west of the Mississippi. That's a significant threat. And since we're in San Francisco, that's where we are. And Russia has also maintained that. They've been very clear that they've continued to advance their triad, both the ICBMs, the strategic bombers, and the submarines. So I think the point, and Douglas MacArthur made this point in 1945 with the surrender of Japan, we require a spiritual recrudescence. Warfare amongst major powers is not possible. It is a question of extinction. So really talking about the strength of military capacity, at this point it isn't a question of World War II, you know, the speed that had developed between World War I and World War II, or just the mechanization that had developed before World War I. We're not talking that kind of strength, because now once an actual full conflict occurs, it's a question of who launches first. And that's what people have lost. They've lost that living sense. World War II generation was conscious of some of these questions. The World War II generation was also, because of the leadership of Franklin Roosevelt, much more aware of an American identity. It became, up until Roosevelt, we had become as petty and fascist as we are today, or at least are close to it. But with Roosevelt, he resurrected an American identity, and that endured for 14 years, and through the war. And because of that, there was something that they had within them as an American identity. Many of them are gone. Mr. LaRouche is 92. He's a remaining part of that generation. This idea of human extinction through war was a real question for them. And unfortunately, it's not real. For even many military commanders and people that discuss it within that field, they don't understand what we're really discussing. And the problem is, it's the same thing MacArthur pointed to. The spiritual recrudescence, or you could say a spiritual renaissance, or a human renaissance, rebirth of man's conception of man. They're limited in capability to address that. What Mr. LaRouche has specifically dedicated his career towards has been that fundamental question. And the problem is that almost no one else has.
How do you spread this, effectively, this message?
Yeah.
How do you get that out? I mean, it comes right down to one thing only: dollars.
Well, yeah, we need money. We need funds. I mean, we raise funds. We have to do that. And
You spread somehow.
well, but it is a question of this. It is a question of 30-second commercials or these kinds of things aren't going to grab people's souls.
No.
It's the penetration of the layers of the population, both the average person on the street, but more and more targeted. Like, as of now, we've spent since October, so now we're talking 6 months of a targeted penetration of Manhattan as the key center of discussion politically of the country. If any major decisions are going to happen, it's going to penetrate the discussion of Manhattan. Unfortunately, most other areas of the country have become irrelevant. I mean, they really are. There's really no other major. Chicago was the center of industry. We don't have it anymore. We have an energy sector in Houston, but that's largely a controlled Wall Street Bush creation. It's in the bush. It's in Houston. It's all still stuck in the bushes. But Manhattan has always been, since Alexander Hamilton and since the American Revolution, that key area. It was key for Lincoln. It was key for Roosevelt, and it's key today. So what we've launched is our Manhattan Project to intersect the leading layers. So when you see Stephen Cohen or Jack Matlock came out a few weeks ago saying he said, I called our foreign policy autistic. He went after the Obama administration. He went after the threat directly of nuclear war and said we are on the verge of war now, worse than we were under the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. This is just 2 weeks ago at the National Press Club.
He changed his tune drastically. I remember when I met him in Moscow, he had a slightly different view at that time.
He did. And actually, a month earlier, we had called him to sign our petition for the BRICS nations? And he said, no, I don't think we're facing nuclear war. So just a month beforehand, he said no. So people are figuring this question out. Now, we've been saying this threat of nuclear war for 4 years. I've spent 4 Christmases organizing around the threat of nuclear war. So what we're finding is that we're penetrating these layers. The problem is the scope of understanding. They might get the threat of nuclear war. They don't see that the premise of it is the collapse of the financial system and what must be done to address that. People have been categorized into their areas of expertise with no strategic understanding of real war is not about just your military strength or this question or that question. Real war is a question of civilization, of full society. And Mr. LaRouche intends to win this war on that basis. That we're actually fighting for the question of what civilization is. And we've got to raise the discussion so that we're penetrating the layers of discussion at this point. You may not say sufficiently, but you could say effectively. But we have to raise the standard of thinking, of actual thought, of understanding, and of courage, which I think is commensurate. Once you get a discovery in someone's mind of the scope of what we're talking about and the potential, what the BRICS really represent, you instill more of the courage that's absolutely necessary right now. So, and San Francisco is also key. We're also moving a large operation up to San Francisco for the same reason. But all of this takes funds, so by all means contribute. So I'll leave my comments there. I'll let Pat get into the...
I'll make one comment.
Okay.
A gentleman earlier talked about how much people were studying the relative strength of nations. And I guess it was about Wednesday, I was watching Chinese television, and they came out with the expenditures on the country's military machines. And the United States is way up in the lead as to spending money for war equipment.
Oh, absolutely.
Something like $586 billion.
Our defense budget is greater than all other nations combined.
This program said the next 8 combined.
Yeah, after that, I think there's probably not much.
And China was second with about 1/3 of the United States. The third one, I've got written down here. Oh, the third one down is the surprise of Saudi Arabia.
Or a dear
if they include all the terrorists, that's probably accurate.
Something like 80 billion. The Russia comes in at 71 billion. So the United States doesn't have any competition when it comes to building weapons of death and destruction.
Right. It's true. As Martin Luther King said, we are the most violent nation on the planet, and that remains true. He said it in 1967, and it's true today. Do you have another comment or question?
No, I'm just listening to all this, being a history and poli-sci major, being fluent in Russian and been there many, many times. German, a few others. I get all their channels. And I look at the suffering that's happening in Russia, and I relay back, speaking to many people there in the universities and so on. They're willing to tighten their belt again and again and again. They're behind Putin. And he gave all the power to Shogoi right now to develop anything he needs to militarily. Bacteriology, chemistry, this, that, that. They can do so much harm in retaliation. It doesn't have to be nuclear.
Yeah.
And then right next door in Cuba. What in the hell are we doing there?
Yeah.
Well, what are they doing there?
Yeah. Yeah, sure. Well, I think you've raised some questions that Pat's going to address. So I'll let him take the floor and we'll continue the discussion.
Well, the theme that Mike began with in terms of the sense of national identity, that's a unique quality that human beings have. It's not, a dog does not have a sense of dogdom, right? And the future of the dog species, that doesn't exist. It only exists in human beings. And that is really the topic that we generally have to address continuously, without fail, and bring that to the American people, that idea of a national identity, that there's a reason that you exist. On February 27th, LaRouche, in the discussion, he said this, he said, "It's not muscular power which moves history. It won't come from overwhelming the enemy through numbers or force. History," he said, "is not a mechanical process. It's not a muscle game. There are higher processes, higher orders. Don't try to explain why history is moving. Be the cause of its movement and create the future." Okay? And what he's getting at, is this idea of creativity. Creativity, is fundamentally, basically, the creation of something that did not exist before. A great piece of music, a scientific discovery, a new world. Okay? But the oligarchy denies the possibility of creativity to exist. Or, if it does say, yeah, there's creativity, but it's irrational, it's impulsive. You can't plan it. It's the little kid throwing his feces on the wall. That's a creative act. Literally, that's the way these people think. But it's even worse. Someone like Obama or Adolf Hitler, will say, "I'm creative. I did something that's never been done before." Hitler will say, "I killed more people than anyone ever in history has killed before. That's how I'm creative." It's an irrational impulse. Because real creativity is bringing to humanity something that develops and enhances the future of humanity. And the oligarchy and the way they think always makes the same mistake. Referring to what LaRouche was saying about force. The force, what is that? Military force, blackmail, various other forms. But it's always one of two things. Either it's based on virtually mechanical action, defined by numbers, defined mathematically. And you see that, for example, in the 1950s in some of the planners of nuclear war, where they would say, well, we could have a nuclear exchange between the Soviet Union and the United States. They would lose 150 million people. We'd lose 100 million. Therefore, we win. Right? That's the mathematical kind of thinking, mechanistic kind of thinking. Or it's looking at the human species itself as nothing more than animals. In psychology, it's called behaviorism. And what you have, is the idea that the primary motivation of human beings is me. That it's my comfort, my money, especially these days, right? And the avoidance of pain. Right? So you threaten other people with pain. It's like dog training, right? You train your dog by giving him a reward or maybe a little punishment. Right? And this is the way Obama thinks. What does he say? We're going to impose sanctions on Russia and cause them pain and change Putin's behavior. Right? Putin's a dog, we make him a little pain and we'll change his behavior. Right? So this is where these ideas come from, that we can carry out limited nuclear war. You know, these kinds of insane ideas. And I think what you really, really have to see with these people today, and this is unlike, say, the early 1960s and the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the world was one step away from annihilation. You did have people then who were insane, right? And you did have people then, like today, who were evil. Right? But in most cases, they weren't stupid, like virtually the entire political leadership of the United States and much of Europe is today. And you add that factor in, and they can't learn anything. And therefore, they will repeat the same kind of stupid mistakes, evil or delusional mistakes that has been carried out before. Now, LaRouche presented the alternative to this kind of thinking a few days later, after what I quoted first. He said, mankind is mortal, but the function of mankind is immortal. The function is what mankind contributes to mankind's own future, mankind's own destiny. And that's what's most important. So you ask, does your life, does the addition of another week in your life, another year in your life, is that the mechanism by which we can improve the destiny of mankind? And people who are serious, they order their lives on the basis of realizing a necessary improvement to the existence and the persistence of their lives, their own lives. They will eventually die. So what's the meaning of their life? The meaning of their life is what they contribute to the future of mankind. And I think, this is really what LaRouche was talking about when a few days after this, discussion, which I just quoted, he said, human beings, if they don't have religion, really aren't human. Right? So, think about that, and I think it'll be worthwhile and useful to do that. Now,
Hamlet's contribution to the Ukraine elements.
Okay. So we're going to start with a nightmare from the past, which has come alive again today. This is a swastika on the helmet of a Ukrainian Azov fighter today. Okay? As our friend in front commented, was that helmet a gift from the British in their supplying the Ukrainians with weapons and equipment? Perhaps it was. Now, this symbol, as you see there, the swastika, was last seen in Ukraine between 1941 and late 1943. And at least 4 million Ukrainians died, along with 20 million plus others in the Soviet Union. And this picture of the Azov battalion personnel, is this grouping of wannabe Nazis, are committing atrocities today in eastern Ukraine. And here's the Azov battalion posing with their favorite flag. And here is Ole Tannenbach, a member of the Ukrainian parliament today with his Seagull salute. These are Victoria Nuland's Nazis who were allowed to take over the country a year ago in a violent coup d'etat supported by the Obama administration, the British, and led on the ground by Victoria Nuland, Obama's Undersecretary of State for European and Eurasian. And then on February 18th, just a couple of weeks ago, the Ukrainian ambassador to Germany, in a primetime German TV interview, actually it was February 18th, right? When the individual doing the interview with him showed the previous picture of the Azov battalion with their Nazi flag, asked him about it. And what did he say? He said, well, yeah, this is the National Guard, the ones that Obama wants to arm and train. And we could not fight the Russians without them. That's what he said, right on national television in Germany. On February 21st, the Deputy Foreign Minister of Ukraine, Glass-Steagall, in a Canada CBC radio interview said, we don't want to scare anybody, but we are preparing for full-scale war. Everybody is afraid of fighting with a nuclear power. We're not afraid. This is the insanity. This is the insanity. But I think the one that really hit the Russians in the gut was Poroshenko, the president of Ukraine, when he made a statement while in the United States that it was Russia who invaded Ukraine and Germany in World War II. Now, actually, before he said that in February, President Putin, earlier in the year, and he was speaking at the Moscow Jewish Museum on the 70th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, said, direct attempts to silence history, to distort and rewrite history, are inadmissible and immoral. Behind these attempts often lies the desire to hide one's own disgrace, the disgrace of cowardice, hypocrisy, and treachery, the intent to justify the direct or indirect collaboration with the Nazis. So these Nazis in Ukraine today are the direct descendants of Stefan Bandera and the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. And then the Bandera organization collaborated in the occupation, the Nazi occupation of Ukraine. They didn't just, run a city for the Nazis or something, right? Which is what you had collaborators do in France or somewhere else, right? No, they personally carried out mass exterminations. For example, in the summer of 1943, the Bandera organization exterminated 70,000 Jews and Poles. And this is the organization that Obama and Cameron in Britain want to provide with lethal arms. This is the path to nuclear war. And so when we say Putin is your friend, you better believe it. And I want to tell you why. Every Russian family can give you a list of all their relatives who were killed by the Nazis in World War II, the invasion of the Soviet Union by the Nazis, including President Putin himself. His grandmother was killed by the Nazis. 3 of his uncles were killed by the Nazis. His brother, 10 years before Putin was born, died in Leningrad, which the Nazis had put under siege. Okay. Thus, my idea or hypothesis is that the reaction to the emergence of Nazis and the sponsorship of Nazis in Ukraine by the US and some of the Europeans, is building up such a level of anger, maybe rage, in the Russian population that says, let's just send the entire Russian army into Ukraine and get rid of these people. And that's what Putin's holding back. Because Putin thinks a little bit higher level. He's thinking of civilization. Because he knows that anything, any provocative, or what can be seen as provocative act by Russia could be the tripwire to nuclear war. Now, as the American-sponsored Nazis keep attacking and killing Russians in eastern Ukraine, and the United States and NATO keep moving more and more troops right to the border of Russia, as they keep modernizing the ABM systems and upgrading and modernizing the tactical nuclear weapons. Now, this is a policy of war, and nobody should have any doubts about that. And it didn't just happen with Obama. Right? Go back to 1997 and the founding of what's called a Project for a New American Century, by, among other of the neocons, a man named Robert Kagan, who just happens to be the husband of Victoria Nuland. Right? And what they said in their founding document is that their intent is to eliminate any nation that could ever challenge America's dominance of the world. And today, the strategic war-fighting doctrine of the United States is to fight and win a nuclear war. In 2006, the Journal of the New York Council of Foreign Relations, Foreign Affairs, ran an article called "The Rise of U.S. Nuclear Primacy." And they define nuclear primacy as the ability to destroy all of an adversary's nuclear forces, eliminating the possibility of a retaliatory strike. The lengthy article's conclusion by the authors was, quote, "The weight of the evidence suggests that Washington is in fact deliberately seeking nuclear primacy." So the insane idea of a tactical nuclear strike on Russia, and then by the mathematical calculations, we should win. Right? It's the same damn thing Hitler thought in 1941. Hitler looked at the German military capability after 2 years of walking over Denmark and France and Poland. And the numbers, the equipment, the experience, the logistic capability of the Germans to wage war. And he compared that to the Soviet Union's capability and said, the mathematical calculation proves that we can attack the Soviet Union and force them to surrender. Okay? That's the way they think. Okay? And so what's going on with the American population? They're being inundated now with war propaganda. Right? And Putin is the greatest monster in human history. If you read American media, the internet or the newspapers or the radio talk shows, or listen to what most of the people in the damn Congress. Right? Hadn't been anything like him since Hitler. That's actually what they say. That's what Hillary Clinton said. Sometime last year. And you wonder why Putin has 85% support of the Russian people. These are, remember a year and a half ago, the 100,000, 200,000 person demonstration in Moscow against Putin? Right? Where's that today? Nowhere. It's gone. Right? 85% of the Russian people support fully Putin. In fact, one poll showed that the 13 or 15% that don't support Putin's policies today, 2% are completely against him, but 13% think he's not tough enough. So you're looking at 98% maybe. Numbers, the polls are what they are. Now, a week ago, Netsov was murdered. And the headline in Fox News, March 4th, 3 days ago, quote, "Crossing the Kremlin, Netsov latest in long line of Putin critics to wind up dead," end quote. Okay? Now, we issued a statement, day before that, March 3rd, which, somebody should make sure there's plenty of them here. It's called "LaRouche Denounces Frame-Up of Putin for Netsov Murder. Calls out Obama." Okay? And you should take hundreds of these and get them out to everyone, okay? Tonight. Because this is an organizing task of breaking through this war propaganda that we are in the midst of. And what you hear about Russia and Putin today is really no different than the months of Nazi propaganda accusing the Poles of threatening a major invasion of Germany in 1939. Right? And then, when the Germans invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939, the Nazi media put out the story that the Poles had invaded Germany and Germany was just defending itself. Right? And the German population believed it. Lynn LaRouche warned yesterday that the the United States is becoming fascist. Well, what does he mean? It's no different than in Germany. Not so much that people go around, throwing Sieg Heil salutes. It's that they tolerate the government and the media doing what they're doing. And remember, the last time in the United States we had this kind of massive war propaganda was 2002, 2003, going into the Iraq War, and the polls were showing 80% of the American people absolutely believed that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. Right? 80%. So someone starts complaining to you about Putin, ask them what they thought in 2003. Were they part of that 80%? Well, if they were, the same media that convinced you of that is one attacking Putin today. So the Russians, look at this war propaganda. They have a word phrase for it. They call it the Putin derangement syndrome. And Putin himself, a week or so ago, warned. He said, "No one should harbor any illusions about it being possible to achieve military supremacy over Russia or to use pressure against us in any way or form. Russia will always have an adequate response to any reckless actions." But Obama, despite the ceasefire in Ukraine, the U.S. and Britain trying to undermine it, threatening to arm the Ukrainians, which actually would violate Article 10 of the ceasefire agreement. That is to remove all equipment and manpower that's foreign to Ukraine. Right? That's part of the ceasefire. Right? So Obama and the British are saying we're going to violate the ceasefire and sabotage, destroy it. Right? And threatening more sanctions against Russia. Now here is the biggest absurdity, the most stupid thing possible, I think. Right? I mean, Obama says by putting more sanctions on Russia, we're going to change Putin's behavior, as if a little economic pain on Russia will make them surrender. When the Nazis killing 27 million people in the Soviet Union, and the Russians didn't surrender to that. Right? Now, what I want to go through is the German-Soviet War of 1941 to 1945. Now, most Americans of my generation, I was born 1944, right, in the middle of World War II. Right? Now, but most Americans of my generation, or slightly a little bit younger, maybe, we had no idea, about really what happened in World War II. We would watch the Hollywood World War II movies. We would get a little bit in school. And what was the story? Right? Well, if some of you older people remember, maybe some of the younger people too. Right? But with that kind of input, and especially during the Cold War, nothing, not a word could be said about the Soviet Union that implied even that they ever did anything good or right. Complete silence. So what was our conclusion? It was that the United States defeated Nazi Germany virtually single-handedly. That is the way we grew up. That's what I thought. Watching Hollywood movies in the 1950s. The truth is, the Soviet Union was invaded by Nazi Germany on June 22nd, 1941, with the greatest military invasion in history. 4 million troops of both Germany and its allies went across the border into the Soviet Union that day. And by May 8th, 1945, almost 4 years later, when Germany surrendered, who had actually defeated Nazi Germany? Well, even Churchill himself in 1944 said it was the Russians who, quote, tore the guts out of the German army, end quote. And in summary, with the greatest military attack in human history on June 22nd, and over the 4 years, 27 million died. But that figure does not tell you the whole story. In fact, it's somewhat of an abstract figure. It's so goddamn big. 27 million, it's hard to grasp, right? Well, that'd be the entire population of Canada today. 30 million approximately. Right? It'd be 3/4 of the population of California. And you maybe get a little grasp of it there, right? But it wasn't just the killing of 27 million people. The Nazis had an explicit scorched earth policy. Destroy everything. They destroyed, literally burned to the ground, thousands of towns and villages. Major cities like Stalingrad, Kharkov, Kiev, Moscow, Leningrad, Rostov were either completely destroyed or damn near so. And others, the same. They targeted for destruction factories, the infrastructure, all the elements of economic life, in orders in order, as the Nazis said, to deliberately increase the death rate and to exterminate the Slavic people. That was the explicit policy of Hitler's Nazis. So this is, but still that doesn't get you, really grasp it yet. World War II, 50 million people dead, less than that in the European theater, 27 million of them in the Soviet Union. But just the Soviet-Nazi war was the biggest war in human history and still is today. What the Nazis did to France or to England or Denmark, it was nothing in comparison. The Soviet Union losing 27 million in World War II. How many did the United States and Britain combined lose? Less than 1 million. Right? So the intent of what I want to go through tonight is twofold. Give you a little bit more sensuous grasp of, why we owe Putin a little bit of things. Because the Russians, in regard to these Nazis, have not forgotten, and they definitely have not forgiven. But in addition, and more fundamentally and more importantly, I think, is that we can grasp a better appreciation for what it means to be human. Human beings unique, creative, but creativity is not just a great scientific discovery, a great artistic production. It's also expressed by the capacity to suffer the most extreme conditions imaginable and still be able to call up those human qualities of imagination, empathy, courage, humor, and the capacity to make a deliberate decision to risk or give one's life for something more universal, for the nation, for civilization itself. As I said, Putin personally lost family members to the Nazis. Putin's family lived in Leningrad in World War II. And the Nazis put Leningrad under a siege for 872 days. Right? 3 million people in Leningrad, 1941. And that 872 days of siege by the Nazis, 1 million, 1/3 starved to death. Another 500,000 were killed by the bombs or the artillery or fighting to keep the Nazis out of the city. Right? So 1.5 million people in Leningrad died, half of the city of 3 million. Right? Putin's father was wounded by the Nazis. His mother almost starved to death. And of course, as I said earlier, his brother did die in the siege of Leningrad. And in an interview in 2010, Putin, reflecting on his family in Leningrad, he said this. He said, but there was a moment, let us say it straight, when no one was taking care of the inhabitants any longer. They were just dying of hunger or freezing to death. This is why it is primarily an immense tragedy of the large numbers of people. And then he said this. But, on the other hand, it is also a feat of valor. It's a case of unparalleled heroism and endurance, that human quality. So let's let's look at a map of World War II in Europe. Kind of, I'll leave it up there for a little bit and get a little sense of it. Point out, the Axis countries, right? The kind of yellow there, which is allied with Germany. The Allies in green, Soviet Union, Britain, and some of the actually liberated North African countries. The neutral countries like Turkey, Spain, Switzerland, Portugal, Sweden, and the Axis-controlled areas, Western Europe, and this shows how far they went in the Soviet Union. Now, I'm not going to discuss the whole 4 years of World War II in Europe, much less, the whole history of World War II, or even the great, all the details of the Soviet-German side of that conflict. But a few things are required to kind of set the stage. So, as we have documented, and others, again and again, it was the British, along with certain Americans like Prescott Bush, who put Hitler in power in 1933. And it's interesting because that was the end of January 1933, about 1 month before President Franklin Roosevelt, it was his first inauguration as president on March 4th, 3 days ago, anniversary of that. Okay? And this is the era of the Great Worldwide Depression, where extremist political movements were arising in Europe, but also in the United States, proliferating. And in Europe, they had no FDR. So these extremist political movements took power. Right? In Germany, Spain, Italy, later in Austria, Hungary, Bulgaria, Romania, and the Czech Republic or Czechoslovakia. And all these countries joined Germany in the June 22nd, 1941 attack on the Soviet Union, plus Finland. Okay. These terrorist street gangs, were supplemental to these fascist governments, which just exterminated, in some cases, all political opposition. And as Hitler began his military buildup for war, the British responded with appeasement. Munich, Neville Chamberlain is famous. Okay? But it was other appeasements before and after Munich. And the French were no damn better. In fact, the French press, all through 1938, 39, 40, before they were conquered by Germany, were advocating that Ukraine be ceded to Hitler in order to prevent an attack on France. Right? I mean, this is the kind of world that you had at the time. Okay? And as the Soviet Union through the 1930s was really underwent tremendous turmoil. And I'm not going to go through it all. I'm just going to feature actually a couple things. One, the massive industrialization of the Soviet Union, which in fact laid the foundations for the ability to defend the Soviet Union in the Nazi attack. And on January 1st, 1939, Stalin warned the nation, quote, "We must be ready at any moment to repel an armed attack on our country and to smash and finish off the enemy on his own territory." All during this period, 1938, 39, into halfway through 1939, the Soviet Union, France, and Britain were negotiating a pact, a defense pact. But it didn't come about because the British sabotaged it. Because the British were thinking, if Hitler's going to start a war, hopefully we can manipulate him into attacking the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union and Germany will destroy each other, and we continue to rule the world. That's the way they were thinking. Okay? So on August 23rd, after the Soviet Union gave up on this potential pact, they signed an agreement with Hitler called the Hitler-Stalin Pact on August 23rd, 1939, in order for what? To forestall a German attack on the Soviet Union. 1 week after the signing of that pact, September 1st, 1939, Germany attacked Poland. By June 1940, Germany had forced the surrender of France, and Germany began bombing England. And in April 1941, Germany declared war on Yugoslavia and Greece. The Soviet knew an attack was coming, but hoped that it could be delayed till 1942 when they would be more prepared. May 5th, 1941, literally a month or so before the attack, Stalin, in a speech to the military academy graduates, said, an attack by Germany before August must not be ruled out. Hopefully, we could be delayed till next year, and then we'll be prepared. Now look at the map for a moment. Again, get a little sense of the geography of what we're talking about. And I'll have another map in a second, which is a little bit more detailed. Right? So much of what I'm presenting and will continue to present is really the topic of this book, Russia at War, 1941 to 1945, by Alexander Worth. This was published in 1964, about 20 years after the end of the war. Worth was a British journalist, but he was born in Russia. And he grew up in Russia until his parents migrated to Britain when he was 17 years old. And 20 years later, he's a prominent journalist in Britain. And he spends almost the entirety of of the German-Soviet war in Russia, on the front lines in many cases. Right? And this book is unique, and because both it's personal, very personal.
What name of
The name of
the author?
the author, Alexander Worth, W-E-R-T-H. I think probably anglicized, name. His parents probably changed their name when they moved to Britain. And also, it's probably one of the few books about Russia or the Soviet Union that is not tainted by the ideologies of the Cold War, either pro-Soviet or pro-Western, right? So, because he is extremely critical of Stalin, and this is during the Khrushchev period after the de-Stalinization, right? And he's just as critical of Khrushchev. He rips Churchill to shreds. He's positive towards Roosevelt. Right? It's not the usual World War II or Soviet Union history book that you'll find. Now, he begins the book, the first page, with a quote from President John Kennedy. Remember, it's published in 1964, a year after Kennedy's assassination. And he quotes Kennedy at his American University speech on June 10th, 1963. Some of you may be familiar with that. But here's the quote that he puts in the book, right at the beginning, from John Kennedy. Kennedy said, among the many traits the peoples of our two countries, the U.S. and the Soviet Union, what we have in common, none is stronger than the mutual abhorrence of war. Almost unique among the major world powers, we have never been at war with each other, and no nation in the history of battle ever suffered more than the Russians suffered in the course of the Second World War. At least 20 million lost their lives. Countless millions of homes and farms were burned and sacked. A third of the nation's European territory, including nearly 2/3 of its industrial base, were turned into a wasteland. Right? So he starts the book with that. And remember, keep that in your mind as we proceed a little bit, because we actually come back to it at the end. Now, Worth also, near the beginning of the book, says this: there is scarcely a Russian family which the German invasion did not affect directly, and usually in the most tragic way. These are still fresh in every older Russian mind, and the young generation of Russians are constantly reminded by books, films, broadcasts, and television shows of what Russia suffered and how she had to fight, first for her survival and then for victory. So, you know, as I said, Operation Barbarossa, right? June 22nd, 1941. First, you know, in the first 5 months, by December 1941, now, the German and its allies' invasion on 3 fronts. And I'll show you those in a moment. But those first 5 months, the attack just ripped through the country, right to the gates of Moscow. 4 million Soviet citizens died those first 4 months. 3 million Soviet soldiers died or injured, and nearly 4 million Soviet soldiers became prisoners of war. And this is what the Nazis did with the Soviet prisoners of war. Right? They killed them all. That was the explicit policy. Now here's Operation Barbarossa. 3 fronts. The northern front is an attack heading toward Leningrad, up there in the near the top somewhere. Right? Get this thing to work. There we go. Leningrad there. The center attack here through Belarus toward Moscow. And the southern attack through Ukraine, aiming at Stalingrad down here, the Crimea here, the Caucasus here, and off the map, the Baku oil fields. Right? So 3 fronts simultaneously, 4 million troops. And, you know, why Leningrad? It was the birthplace of the Bolshevik Revolution. It's the major industrial center, but it's also the soul of Russia. Right? It was a capital under Peter the Great. And it is the home of people like Pushkin and others of the great Russian national Renaissance tradition. Right? Now, I'm going to show you a quick video in order to, you know, kind of lock this in a little bit in terms of exactly what those first 5 months are.
Does it need sound? Does it have sound?
No.
Okay.
Yeah, it does, but you don't want to hear it.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
The movie in Netflix about movie in Netflix about St. Petersburg siege.
I'm sorry, I don't hear.
It's a movie in Netflix about siege of St. Petersburg.
There's a movie in Netflix.
About St. Petersburg.
About
Siege.
siege.
Yeah, I'm very hard of hearing, so it's someone. All right. Anyway. Somehow. The video is only about 3 minutes, because we're able to get it up here.
If this gentleman's going to get some of those slides out that you said to get out, he's got to leave. You want him to he'll take some of those slides.
I can fix that.
Did you?
All right, here we go. Up in the right-hand corner, you see the calendar. And this is the movement of the Nazi armies. We're in about the second or third week now. Got the music in there. First month.
This is trench warfare right there. Here, man.
We were Leningrad here, Moscow here, Stalingrad's down here.
That was asked. That was all 1940. That was the first year, or
No, that's first 5 months. That's through December 1941, June to December. The first days of the Germans wiped out literally the first 2-3 days, nearly the entire Soviet Air Force was wiped out. You know? Within a few weeks, Nazi troops were hundreds of miles into the Soviet Union, captured major cities and killed millions. A huge area of the country, as we saw, was occupied, over 500,000 square miles. By July 8th, the Germans were already saying that the war with Russia was almost won. And by November, the Nazis were at the gates of Moscow, nearly 1,000 miles from Berlin. And in fact, Hitler planned a victory march in Moscow for January. So from that time until the end of the war, 8.7 million Soviet troops were killed, in addition to about 20 million civilians. But what the Nazis didn't do is break the nation. They misjudged the capability for mobilization that the decades of the 1930s industrialization had produced. Most importantly, they did not expect the citizens of the Soviet Union to fight, seriously fight, to refuse to surrender, to continue to be human. Germans were shocked after Barbarossa and the massive defeat after defeat of the Soviet armies. 10 million more Soviet citizens joined the military, and millions more joined the mobilization. And Russia carried out virtually a miraculous evacuation of its industrial capability out of the path of the Nazi armies far to the east. This was literally thousands of factories. Entire factories were moved. By 1940, by the time of the attack on Moscow, by October, November 41, thousands of factories had been evacuated to the east, and tens of thousands of the workers in those factories, who are the ones who moved it, working 14, 20 hours a day with no breaks and no days off in order to save the industrial capability for defense. And then, so that's the beginning. Right? 11 days after Barbarossa, July 3rd, Stalin addressed the nation and the people responded. I'm not going to go through his whole presentation. It was over the radio nationwide. But among other things, he said the Red Army and Navy and the whole Soviet people must fight for every inch of Soviet soil. Fight to the last drop of blood for our towns and villages. Whenever units of the Red Army are forced to retreat, all railway rolling stock must be driven away. The enemy must not be left a single engine or a single railway truck, and not a pound of bread nor a pint of oil. In the occupied areas, intolerable conditions must be created for the enemy and his accomplices, who must be persecuted and destroyed at every step. All the strength of the people must be used to smash the enemy onward to victory. And it really was a speech that mobilized the nation. You had a leader who was fearless and determined, and that was exactly what the population needed and required. The hope of victory that he enunciated, people grabbed it. Many years after the war, a novel called The Living and the Dead by Konstantin Simonov. He portrays a scene in a military hospital that day, July 3rd. And the patients in the hospital are listening to Stalin's speech. And so the novel reads as follows. There was a discrepancy between that even voice and the tragic situation of which he spoke. And in this discrepancy, there was strength. They loved him in different ways, wholeheartedly, or with reservations, admiring him and yet fearing him. And some did not like him at all. But nobody doubted his courage and his iron will. And now was a time when those two qualities were needed more than anything else in the man who stood at the head of a country at war. Stalin appealed to the population to defend the nation, to defend the motherland, to defend their homes and their children, and the population responded. Now, of all the hundreds of battles in this war, I'm going to just briefly focus on three of them: Leningrad, Moscow, and Stalingrad. And the first one is Leningrad. The Nazis reached the outskirts of Leningrad in September or August 1941, and there they were stopped. Hitler had been confident that Leningrad would quickly fall. It never did. For 872 days, the city was under siege and almost completely cut off from the rest of Russia. For the first 2.5 years, nothing in World War II comes close to the destruction and death that was seen in Leningrad. As I said, 1 million starved, 500,000 died fighting the Nazis. But nobody would surrender. the city would not surrender. And it wouldn't have done them any good anyway, because on October 7th, Hitler ordered that the city should be wiped off the face of the earth and the entire population exterminated. So, especially that first winter, 41, 42, the city, as you can see, this is the city. And the Finland, an ally of Germany, was pushing here on the northern border of Leningrad. The Nazis came up here, and all the way to the lake, completely cutting off the city from the rest of Russia. The only way to get supplies in or people out or in was across the lake, about 50 miles across the lake, Lake Larouche. In the summer, it was by boat. And in the winter, because the lake would freeze over, it was by an ice road where trucks would bring in supplies and take people out. But the Germans would constantly be bombing that supply line. So not only was it dangerous, but it was more than perilous. And also, it obviously could not bring in a lot or take out a lot of people. And the first winter, well, the siege was partially broken in January 1943, almost a year and a half after the siege began, when the Soviet armies broke through here and created a land connection. But that was still very dangerous because it's fairly narrow. And tens of thousands were evacuated, and more military equipment and food brought in. Starvation continued, though, because it couldn't get enough in. And in that first winter, where tens of thousands died of starvation every month, that was the worst. By November 41, the only food available was 4 ounces of bread per day, per person. Think of that. And 60% of that bread was sawdust or other inedibles. And by January, even that was not available except for military personnel and factory workers. The children, women, the old people got nothing. So you see this Leningrad under siege. That's one picture. There's another one, bodies being buried during, you really, if you get really a sense of it, that winter, the Russian winter, 20 degrees below zero, no fuel in the city, so no heat, no electricity, no food, and constant bombardment by German artillery and airplanes. That's the nature of the beast. And yet, through all this, let's see, it's a little warm, but through all this, the population did not give up. In fact, the population inspired themselves, reaching into their souls to live, to work, to fight for one more day. There's a factory manager that Worth actually quotes, and there's 100 stories like this in the book, but he says, the factory manager says, and one day in December 1941, 20 degrees below zero, all the windows were blown out by a bomb. And I thought to myself, no, we really can't go on. Not to the spring. We can't go on in this temperature, and without light, without water, and almost without food. And yet somehow we didn't stop. A kind of instinct told us we mustn't, that it would be worse than suicide and a little like treason. And sure enough, within 36 hours we were working again, working in altogether hellish conditions 8 degrees below zero, 14 degrees below zero in this office where you're now sitting. Yes, to this day, I cannot quite understand it. I don't quite understand how it was possible to have all that willpower, that strength of mind. Many of the people hardly able to walk with hunger would drag themselves to the factory every day, 8, 10, even 12 kilometers, for there were no trams. And the siege ended in January 1944 when the Russians just pushed all the remaining Nazi forces away from the city. And in Moscow, toward the end of 1941, the second focal point I want to give you, about halfway between Warsaw, Poland, and Moscow is a city called Smolensk. And for the first time, the Nazi onslaught was stopped as it was heading toward Moscow for a couple of weeks, which gave more time to prepare the defenses of Moscow. And within a month from the beginning of Operation Barbarossa, the German army and the Nazi shock troops became the greatest recruiter for the Soviet resistance. In Belarus, which was occupied by the Nazis for 2 years, they turned it into a desert zone. In addition to 3 million people in Belarus killed, 380,000, mostly young people, were deported to Germany as slave labor. And what you see, mass murder of civilians in Belarus. Captain in Solmensk said this. He said, "This is a grim war, and you cannot imagine the hatred the Germans have stirred up among our people. We are easygoing, good-natured people, but I assure you, they have turned our people into spiteful mujiks." That's what we've got in the Red Army now. Men thirsting for revenge. I have never known such hatred before, and there's good reason for it. Think of those towns and villages over there. Think of all the torture and degradation these people are made to suffer. There comes a moment when people can't bear it any longer. They go off into the woods in hope they may murder a German sometime. Now, as the German armies approached Moscow in September, October of 1941, and then at the gates of Moscow launched 3 successive attacks. The first 2 were stopped, and the third became a catastrophic disaster for the Germans. Okay? And here's the German encirclement of Moscow. As you see, they came in from 3 directions here. And and again, Stalin had mobilized the population. While the Nazi troops are just a few miles outside of the city limits of Moscow, on November 6th, celebrating the 24th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution, Stalin gave a speech, and after quoting some of the statements of the Nazi leaders on exterminating the Slavic people, Stalin said, "And it is these people without honor or conscience, these people with the morality of animals, who have the effrontery to call for the extermination of the great Russian nation." And then Stalin goes through a list of names. Some of them you wouldn't recognize. I'm not going to read them all. But he actually starts with some of the leaders of the Bolshevik Revolution, like Plekhanov and Lenin. And then he moves to Pushkin and Tolstoy, the Russian authors, Gorky, Chekhov. then Tchaikovsky, I get tired. Anyway, and the scientists like Pavlov. Right? He said they want to exterminate this nation of great thinkers and contributors to the building of the Russian nation. No mercy for the German invaders. Okay? And by the first week of December, the Nazis have been stopped at the gates of Moscow, and the Russian counteroffensive began. It's a little hard to see on this map, right? But what you had here was a counteroffensive that began December 5th and 6th, 1941, along an almost 600-mile front, all the way along here. Literally, a classic double envelopment, which will be repeated in Stalingrad. Right? That is, the Nazi forces are concentrated in a front now right against Moscow. And outside of that, the Russian armies encircled the German troops. And these German troops, also had another army, or effectively an army, hit them at the same time. This is December, Moscow. Suddenly, below freezing temperatures and a blizzard. And many of the German troops still were in their summer uniforms. And tens of thousands of German troops were killed or froze to death, at the gates of Moscow. Now, so that's the Russian counteroffensive. And for the next couple months, the spirit of the Russian people was, we drove them back. In some cases, drove them back 200 miles. Right? But then, the summer, beginning May of 1942, the Germans launched a new offensive. This time, this time to the south, to Ukraine, towards Stalingrad. Right? And when you look at the occupation of Russia during this period, you see, with the attack on Ukraine in the summer of 1942, the most violent phase of the German attack. Now, all during this period, late 1941, 42, 43, the United States and Britain, in alliance with the Soviet Union, are providing, especially the United States, millions of tons of equipment and food and raw materials, coming in from across the Pacific or up through Iran. The British significantly less. And Stalin is pushing Churchill and Roosevelt to open a second front in 1942. And when that wasn't done in 42, he said it has to be in 43. It was not done until June of 44. Right? And Wendell Willkie, who was Roosevelt's envoy to Stalin, said Roosevelt was all in favor of a second front to be opened in 1943, but that he had met opposition from the British generals and Churchill himself. Now, Churchill, in his 6-volume history of World War II, says why. He said, in planning the gigantic enterprise of 1943, it was not possible for us to lay aside all other duties. Our first imperial duty was to defend India. In other words, the British Empire. Now, the Nazis in Ukraine outrightly executed tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people. Anyone who was a Jew, a soldier, a Russian, a member of the Communist Party, or anybody who was in the way. This is in Ukraine. There's a Russian medic being hanged by German soldiers. The entire population of villages was simply exterminated. Kharkov, a city of 1 million people before 1941. As the Nazis approached, 300,000 were able to be evacuated. Right? And so when there were 700,000 in it when the Nazis occupied Kharkov, and when it was liberated by the Soviet Army in 1943, less than 2 years later, there were only 350,000 survivors of the 700,000. Okay? Now, what they did to Ukraine, as one of our associates put it, Ukraine looked like the rubble field that a nuclear bomb had created. Nearly 4 million, mostly young Russians, Belarusians, and especially Ukrainians, were deported by the Nazis to Germany as slave laborers. So the 1942 offensive by the Germans, as you can see, this orange area starts here and again occupies huge area, right up to the gates of Stalingrad and into the Crimea and into the Caucasus. But they were stopped before they reached the Baku oil fields, and they were definitely stopped at Stalingrad. The Worth puts the sense of identity, of emotion, of what the Russian people were thinking and doing. He puts it this way: so far, two feelings have characterized the literature and propaganda of that summer of 1942. One was the same love of Russia that had been so typical of all the writings at the height of the Battle of Moscow, only it was now a love that had even greater warmth and greater tenderness. It was, too, specifically, a love of Russia proper, to which, apart from the Caucasus, the German advances had by now reduced the European part of the USSR. The other element was hate. Hate no longer mingled with ridicule, or scarcely so. It grew during those summer months till it reached a paroxysm of frenzy during the blackest days of August. Kill the Germans became like Russia's 10 Commandments, all in one. He gives an example, the Russian journalist, propagandist Ehrenberg, who was a favorite among the Russian soldiers. Ehrenberg writes, "We're remembering everything. Now we know the Germans are not human. Now the German has become the most terrible swear word. Let us not speak. Let us not be indignant. Let us kill. If you do not kill the German will kill you. He will carry away your family and torture them in his damned Germany. If you have killed one German, kill another. There's nothing jollier than German corpses." Right? So you get a sense of this emotion, right? Somewhat contradictory. The love of Russia, the love of the fatherland, the love of family, the love of humanity. But what the Nazis had done just could not hold back. Anger is a very valid emotion, but rage is anger out of control. Right? And what's very unique about this war is that the leadership of Russia, or the Soviet Union, never blamed the German people. They put it always on the Nazis and Hitler. Right? Now that doesn't mean that the common average soldier understood the distinction. Right? And you see this kind of example of rage. Right? So the attack on Stalingrad, you know, July through September 1942, you know, was accompanied by massive air raids by the German Air Force. In fact, in one day in Stalingrad, 40,000 people died in the air raids. And from mid-September to November 18th was the historic battle inside Stalingrad. Right? The German army took Stalingrad. There were just a few pockets where the Russians continued to hold out. Right? And you see the soldiers inside Stalingrad. I don't know if those Russian soldiers or German soldiers. I can't tell. Right? But then on November 19th came the Russian counteroffensive. Another double envelopment. As effective, but much larger than the classic double envelopment of the Persians by Alexander the Great in 331 BC. You know, and essentially, an envelopment is where the enemy force is here, and you split your forces, go around them, surround them, cut them off, and then squeeze them. Right? That's what the Russians did to 500,000 troops who were occupying Leningrad. And by January, early January, you know, the Russians had literally exterminated or captured as prisoners nearly 500,000 German prisoners of war. And that was the end of the German offensive capability in the Soviet Union. There was one more major attack by the Germans, and that was the Battle of Kursk in Ukraine in July of 1943. The biggest tank battle in history, 6,000 tanks, you know, and half or more of them destroyed on both sides in the course of that battle. Another disaster for the Germans. Right? So, for the next year and a half, the Russians moved west, driving the Germans back. You know? And you see these two maps of huge areas that Russians retook. You know, and here we are. You can't quite see it, but literally they're you know, Berlin is right here. You know, so you're by May of 1945. You know, the Russians are in Germany, and remember what Stalin said on July 3rd, 1941, 11 days after Operation Barbarossa. We're going to drive the Germans back to their own country and totally destroy them. The last battle of this war was the Battle of Berlin. 3.5 million troops were involved in the battle. I mean, just think of this. One battle, 3.5 million troops on both sides. By May 8th, the Russians had captured 500,000 German soldiers. And the cost to the Russians in this one battle was 305,000 dead and wounded. One battle. You know, compare that to the Allies. Right? Germany, or Britain and the United States, in the entirety of 1945, the last 5 months of the war, they had, where's my number here? 260,000 casualties. Right? But the Russians had 300,000 and won in the final battle. Right? So here's the Russians putting the Soviet flag on the highest existing point in Berlin on May 8th, May 9th, 1945. Russia then declared war on Japan. Now, remember, the United States and Britain were fighting Japan since, you know, Pearl Harbor. You know, and Japan was an ally of Germany, but there was no fighting between Russia and Japan all during 1941 through 45. Why not? Because Japan did not want to be fighting a two-front war in the Pacific and against Russia. And Russia didn't want to fight a two-front war on the east and in the west. So there's no treaty, there's no formal agreement. They just didn't attack each other. Right? But the Russians declared war on Japan in May, told the United States and Britain that the Russian troops would be ready to attack the Japanese forces on mid-August 1945. On August 6th and 8th, 1945, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the atomic bomb attacks on Japan. Japan had actually attempted in February, March to get the Soviet Union to negotiate their surrender. They were willing to surrender. You know, we've reported before that the Japanese went through the Vatican trying to surrender. Right? But that was rejected by Truman, since Franklin Roosevelt had died in April and Truman was now president. Jimmy Burns, Truman's Secretary of State, quoted in the U.S. News World Report in 1960, said, "We wanted to get through the Japanese phase of the war before the Russians came in." Okay? So it was not only that, though, it was also to intimidate the Soviet Union with the power of what the atomic bomb represented. And remember Putin's warning that I'd read earlier. No one should ever harbor any illusions about it being possible to achieve military supremacy over Russia. And keep that in mind as I read the final paragraph of Worth's book, which echo what he began with, President Kennedy's August 10th, 1963 speech at American University. So Worth writes, you know, because now you're in the Cold War, and he's discussing that, and he says, yet despite the disappointments that followed it, the grim but heroic national war of 1941 through 45 remains both the most fearful and proudest moment of the Russian people. A war which, for all her losses, turned Russia into the greatest power of the old world. Already, it almost seems an historical epic of a bygone age which can never be repeated. To the Russian people, the thought of another war is doubly horrifying, for it would be a war without its Sevastopols, Leningrad, or Stalingrad, a war in which everywhere there would be only victims and no heroes. So, I hope I've got a little bit of thought going into your minds here. So, question, and remember, as I said, I'm really hard of hearing, so get really loud, yell your questions. All right, so.
Well, I'm part Russian on one side of the family, and I'm a few years older than you. So I sort of grew up with some of these stories. And most of the American public was never taught that in school. You had to really go into higher learning to get the details of what it was. And there was, it was unfathomable. Really, I'd go, when I was in college, I'd go to the library and look up the New York Times through microfilm, and almost all the war was heavily censored, so the general public didn't really know the hell that was going on.
You know, there's one exception to that. That was Franklin Roosevelt. Read his fireside chats.
That was only about 4 or 5 years old.
Yeah, you wouldn't have understood it if you heard him.
No,
But between 1933 and 1945, Roosevelt gave 33 of these fireside chats. And when after Pearl Harbor, you know, the first Sunday night fireside chat over nationwide radio, Roosevelt said, by next Sunday, I want you all to have a world map so you can follow what is going on in this war as I speak about it next Sunday. Okay? And he would tell the truth, especially in regard to the Soviet Union and the Nazis. You know, but Roosevelt died before a month before the Nazis surrendered. And so what he represented died with him. And we got what we got, which has led us to this.
It was between night and day. That shot the vision like most of 45. Even if he was part Russian, he was a nice person. Then came this Winston Churchill speech in Missouri.
47.
47. It just changed dramatically.
Yeah. Ned?
Yeah. You mentioned the Barbarossa push or faction of the war. I don't understand what the term Barbarossa and what that was. Was that the entirety of what you went through?
No, that's just the first 5 months.
That was just the first 5 months in Berlin.
Right. That's the initial attack.
Okay.
Right, on the 3 fronts.
Hitler wrote this name, right? It's not his
And as usual, the Nazis or any of these kind of fascists, you know, the word Barbarossa references Emperor Barbarossa, you know, who was a great warrior, but he sure as hell wasn't a Nazi, you know. So, you know, they will appropriate whatever they want to appropriate.
Well, Stalin was a bad cookie himself. He was responsible for millions of deaths of the Russian soldiers. Oh, Stalin. He put inexperienced soldiers. He put people for all kinds of work. He put them in uniforms and sent them to the front lines. They had no clue. They didn't know how to fight. And his own officers, he punished them and even has them executed. You know, so at least he was an animal.
Yeah. No.
Stalin. He was a bad guy.
Well, yeah. I always, one second, no.
I would like to answer like a Russian. I grew up in Russia. I came here only like 8 years ago. It's like experiment. I don't know how I remember that, but I can tell you like Russians understand about all this Stalin repression, and they can blame Stalin about his cruelty, or you never blame him about this war order because it was a really difficult, unpredictable time. Maybe he got even mad after all this event, who knows, because it was some opinion like maybe he lost his mind and even he was this cruel. But he was like icon for people. People just need some, I don't know, like idol in this moment who can just leave him with some straight, you know, order. He actually was grown in monastery in Georgia, Stalin. So he got some kind of like monastery development inside himself. Maybe even this one helped. And so we never blame him about his war crime of some kind. Yeah, we have some book which reveals some kind of cruelty, but who knows who can win this war? If not him, maybe somebody else can, or maybe we'll lose this war in other way. But I'm surprised in the United States people neither learn this one in school about Russia because in Russia we know everything about that. There are too many films, even too many films about this. It's difficult to watch. But we understand very good which is to be involved, especially in this time, because it's much more powerful weapons, and we understand that all will be bad. So it was difficult for Russian, like forgive Germany from some point, but anyway, it's taking time. And now I'm accepting person that some country bad situation, and American escalates this kind of feeling, and Russia now almost, I don't know how many percent, but became some country hate America.
Oh, yeah.
Just,
And,
not matter what.
Yeah,
And they don't know. I have experience, I can see all these nice people here, but from a Russian side, if you just even in Russia, you don't know anything, you don't have any personal contact, and people cannot understand what the hell happening and what is about doing is it normal person, how it's possible. And they chat in Russian side, and they just singing pictures of some kind of like anecdotes and some kind of like fun stuff. But I'm really sorry it's this difficult situation now, and this escalation has to be broken actually. It's for sure. I want to say Russia published this official military doctrine last year, and probably Putin put signature under that, because before we got some doctrine, but it was not clear who is enemy actually. But here Russian probably decide to say out again that Russian have only defensive purpose of all military forces. So they don't mention to attack any country or any other nation to be aggressive. They just tend to declare it's only defensive. So it's maybe some step to the peaceful development.
Well, we shall see.
I think
Russia's put more than Obama, administration.
but one really must be careful, in taking, say, what you described Stalin did, and say that's the cause. No,
not
the cause.
But he was he was not a good guy either.
No one said
same level as Hitler was an army.
No.
They respected each other as enemies, on the same level. Right?
No. Actually, that's wrong. Just wait. Right? That's wrong itself. Right? No one says Stalin was an angel. Stalin made a lot of mistakes, especially in the 1930s, purging of the military. Right? And then at the time of Barbarossa, the attack, the Soviet military was inadequately deployed for defense, didn't have equipment, didn't have enough training. The tanks.
Stalin was behind that. He was responsible for a lot of
hold on. Just wait.
I have to make a remark.
No, wait. Just wait.
Stalin is one of the most controversial characters in history. You either hate him or love him. And there's no peace between those two images of the man.
I know.
That's
what I'm trying to address here.
Yeah.
Right? That this is not a discussion of the defense of Stalin, right? Or the defense of the Soviet Union Communist Party and its history or its actions.
I only mentioned that because you kind of emphasized all what Germany used to do and all what they did, but Russia didn't do anything like, especially with Stalin. You didn't mention that he also.
No, there's no such thing as a balance in this. Because what was at stake was exactly the continued existence of human civilization. If Hitler had not been stopped by the Soviet Union, you wouldn't be here today.
But you know,
The United States would not be here today. Because in January 1942, a month after Pearl Harbor, a meeting between General Marshall, General Eisenhower, and a few others, the top military leaders in the United States, said they were discussing that we are not going to be able to win this war, but we can't let that be our what leads us to this. And you just think about it. If Stalin had not stopped Hitler, the United States itself wouldn't exist today. So there's no comparison. Stalin committed crimes. Stalin was, made horrendous mistakes. Right? But where did those crimes and mistakes come from? It came from after the Bolshevik Revolution. 15 countries invaded the Soviet Union, including the United States. Right? So for the next decade, Russia, Soviet Union's fighting the Civil War. Right? So a level of conflict within the nation led to the kind of extreme brutality and, in certain cases, mass murder that Stalin carried out. Right? But you always want to get at the cause, not the symptoms.
Well, the cause is just greed and power and control by the bankers.
No.
Oh yes, the
cause
banks
is,
caused that.
No, the
banks
cause
set it in motion.
Yeah.
Because it's about profit, making money,
No.
and control.
The cause is the oligarchy. The idea that human beings aren't human and they can be exterminated. That's the cause. It's this system, right? It's not this guy's greedy or something. It's a system that maybe greed is a little side symptom of, or control or power. That's a symptom of a very evil system, right? And you got to get at the system and as the root cause of not only the bringing to Hitler to power in Germany, which the British did, right? But also then all of World War II. So what was the cause of the death of Soviet soldiers, incompetently or brutally deployed by Stalin? It was a goddamn monarchy of Britain that did it, right? So turn your anger on the real enemy, and let's drive the British, out of all power, bring to the forefront, that kind of Renaissance thinking of the American system. Right? And that's what's possible for us to do now. Or else we will face that extermination that Kennedy warned about, that Wirth at the end of his book warns about. Okay? And so it's not academic debate about this or that in history. Right? It is a question of who we are. As LaRouche said in what I quoted in the beginning, don't observe history or try to analyze it, make history. Commit yourself to pushing the process forward that changes the course of the direction of human society. Right? That's our job. Okay? That's why we have these discussions. Try to evoke that from more and more people. Bring all of us to that quality of human beings that LaRouche discusses, that we know we're going to die someday. So what the hell why should you live another week or a month or a year or 10 years, right? Because you're going to do something that's important for humanity, for future humanity, for people not even born yet, right? And that's what we do as an organization, to try to evoke that from a lot of people, right? So All right, getting a little late. Any other questions or comments?
Yeah, again, sometimes when I think about World War II, I find it difficult to understand why some people can become so incredibly evil and indifferent to other human beings.
Excellent. Because yesterday LaRouche was talking about that. Said most Americans today cannot conceive of how these monsters like Victoria Nuland or Obama or the British, are willing to risk the extinction of the human race. Right? Well, you do know what Hitler did, and you know that's evil. Right? Well, he wasn't the last one, and he wasn't even the responsible one in the fundamental sense. Right? And those same people that created him are the ones that are creating the danger today. Now, most people you talk to about that will say, "Oh, I don't believe it." The problem is they don't want to believe it. That's where the real problem is, right? Because if they believed it, then they have to do something about it. They don't want to take responsibility. We have to evoke from people a little bit of responsibility. That's what real organizing is. That's why you should get, contribute as much as you can financially, because this organization needs it in order to do our work. And bring more people in. Give us the names and phone numbers of some people that you want us to talk to, and we'll call them up and do some fundraising with them and recruit them.
One last remark. A lot of people are afraid of responsibility because you have to own up to it. They're afraid of it. They'd rather let somebody else take care of problems.
That's right. But, at a certain point, people know they have no other choice but to act. And that's what the Greeks are doing right now. They've been pushed to the wall, and now they're beginning to act. 4 years they suffered it, the genocidal conditions, and now they're beginning to act. Maybe we could evoke from the Americans the same kind of, you're pushed to the wall now with this threat. So now it's time to act. So let's end it there, and where did that go?
Oh, discussion. Sounds good.
Okay.
Yeah, good.
Yeah, we're going to have